Please take your seats, the event is about to begin. We have no planned fire alarm tests today. If the alarm sounds, please make your way to the nearest exit. Members of the Bloomberg security team will be on hand to guide you. Please take a moment to locate your nearest exit. As a courtesy to our speakers, we kindly ask that you switch your phones to silent. Thank you.
Right. Richard. Wow. Good evening, everybody. I'm Sally Ann Taylor, Government Relations Director here at Bloomberg, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our event this evening and our special guest, Richard Tice, Deputy Leader of Reform UK and MP for Boston and Skegness. We're really pleased to host Reform UK's event here tonight in the heart of the city, as it was only a couple of weeks ago that we hosted Nigel Farage, the leader of Reform UK, on the Michelle Hussein show. If you haven't listened to it, I very strongly urge you to find it on Bloomberg's website. It's very good. This evening, we will hear from Richard on Reform UK's plans for unlocking economic growth in the UK and the party's approach to financial regulation, pensions, taxes, and SME fundraising. As we know, growth does not happen in a vacuum. It takes businesses, people, and institutions to work together and collaborate. And we have to work together. And as we come together at a moment when the UK is facing profound challenges, but also extraordinary opportunities, we have the enduring role of the city as the financial leader within the world, and we have the adoption of AI and new digital infrastructure. Here at Bloomberg, daily we see how connected global markets are, but we also see how fragile those connections can be. And so it is more important than ever that we have resilient markets, smart regulation, and strong institutions to support that growth. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Richard Tice, Deputy Leader of Reform UK, who will talk about the party's plans for unlocking economic reform in the UK. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally Ann. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's fantastic to see you here. Thank you so much. And thank you to Bloomberg for allowing me to be here. This incredible headquarters building. As a real estate guy, I'm always completely wowed by these type of buildings, and in the interest of full transparency, as a very modest Bloomberg subscriber, I may have paid for a little square centimetre of paint somewhere. But I remember the previous HQ because when I was chief executive of a multinational billion-pound stock market listed company, I used to come and present to the analysts and investors and shareholders. But it's a good moment amongst all of the sort of the noise of the budget in a couple of weeks' time, actually to sort of take a strategic step back and sort of say, where are we, what's going on, and what's the future? And the reality is, I think all of us in this room, those in the world of business, know that we are not in a great place. We have two critical issues that we need to talk about and face into. The first is we've got a growth crisis. And the second is we've got a debt crisis. And I'm just going to show this evening two graphs just to sort of demonstrate the sort of thing that's going on and could happen over the coming years. So the first graph, hopefully, will appear, fingers crossed. This graph there, you won't have seen this. This is per adult, based on real figures, 2025. This is the blue line is GDP per adult. And as you can see, in the last 7 years, it's basically gone nowhere. Per adult, no GDP growth whatsoever. Indeed, in the last 10 years, it's barely shifted. Not even a round of drinks, frankly. But the red line is the national debt per adult. And 15 years ago, if that was just over 70% of GDP per adult, you can see the trend. It is heading relentlessly, give or take 95% per adult. That trend is very bad. And that takes us to where we are today. And you then think, well, how much growth is there? Everybody's talking about the lack of growth. Well, a year ago, just over a year ago, in the OBR's report, they had a series of scenarios as to what might happen to GDP, relative debt, relative to the size of GDP in the economy. And they had a range of scenarios. And everyone's forgotten the low productivity scenario. And yet, what are we hearing from the OBR at the moment? Productivity is down. So if we look at the next graph, this is the scary one. Because this shows, hopefully there, that shows the red line currently, debt to GDP, a whisker under 100%. And for the next decade, based on the low productivity growth scenario, effectively, debt to GDP is not going to go down. But then the scary bit is in the subsequent 10 years, when relentlessly it'll climb. 20 years' time, it'll be 150+%. In 2050, everyone talks about 2050 relative to net zero. In 2050, if we don't change course, debt to GDP in the UK will be 200%. We all know that is unsustainable. That is a rapid route towards bankruptcy. We cannot tolerate this, and we cannot ignore that graph. It is the starkest graph that everybody should be focusing on. Now, some of us, we're lucky enough, old enough to remember when we really had lots of growth. But to get growth, you need a critical thing. You need to accept the concept of risk. Risk actually is a good thing. We say the biggest risk in life is never taking one. And if you want a risk-free return, we all know that's not going to generate a lot. If you want growth, you've actually got to take a sensible, calculated amount of risk. So you then say, well, what's sensible and calculated? Well, it's almost 40 years ago since the city had what many of us will remember and was called Big Bang. And it was the moment of change in the City of London, the moment of deregulation, when everything changed. And of course, financial services and the healthy growth of the economy are intrinsically linked, like a sort of umbilical cord. When financial services are doing well, the UK economy is doing well, and vice versa. And back then, in the 80s and 90s, we almost got complacent of growth between 2.5% to 3.5% year in, year out, with a couple of exceptions. And we'd sort of say, if it got below 2%, we'd get a little bit worried. Below 1% was like a moral recession. Now, you get to 1% and they break out the champagne. That's not growth. That doesn't give us options. And if we have no growth at all, which is the last 3 months, for example, then that's the graph that we are facing because of all the liabilities that we're talking about. So smart risk is actually a good thing. And after the Big Bang for sort of 15 to 20 years, generally things were working out pretty well. But you then have to look at what's happened in the last 10 to 12 years here in the city, in financial services. And I think most people would recognize there's a problem. And you've only got to look at the simple data with regard to IPOs. 2011 to 2015, averaging about 100 a year. 2022, it was just 42. 2023, just over 20. Last year, I think it was 18. And this year, well done, I think we've got to 13. That trend is disastrous. You all know what that means in terms of M&A activity, growth. And you say, well, what's going on? Well, companies, it's worse than that because the number of companies listed on stock exchange, I think in the UK now, is 40% lower than in 2008, 25% lower than a decade ago. Companies are delisting. They're relisting elsewhere, very often primarily in the US. They're being bought out by private equity. We've got a serious problem. So then we have to say, well, what is the problem? And our contention, my belief, is that we've primarily got a major problem of over-regulation. Things are so complicated. When I sat next to the chair of a major retail bank just a few weeks ago, and he said to me, 15% of his staff are in compliance, I thought, wow. I mean, if he'd asked me to guess, I'd have said 2, 3, maybe 5 at a push, 15%. And you then say, well, okay, how's that regulation, how's that compliance going? I mean, we've got the Bank of England, we've got the PRA, we've got the FCA. Amongst them all, give or take, it's about 10,000 regulators. And people think that's going to save us all. Well, let's just look at the track record, shall we? And let's be really challenging about it. Did it stop the PPI scandal? No. Did it identify the risks of the financial crash? No. Did it prevent the car loan scandal? No. Did it prevent the gated scandal of open-ended real estate funds, something that I've been talking about for many years? No. Basic common sense. Did it spot and prevent the LDI crisis, which was fundamentally a critical part of the bond market crisis in September 2022? No, everybody knew it was there, including the Bank of England's own pension fund. And yet the reality is, leveraged LDI was a catastrophe. What's the point of regulators, thousands and thousands of them, if they're not going to do the job properly? These are the difficult questions that we have to ask ourselves. Fundamentally, 10,000 regulators have not stopped those sort of scandals. And many of those actually were about common sense. I think when you looked at the LDI scandal, lots of people sort of knew it was there. Did it really make sense for lots of pension funds to buy long bonds yielding 0.75%? Where's the growth in that? So I think it's just a fundamental flaw in common sense. So those are the challenges. And if you over-regulate, don't be surprised if the evidence is that businesses are not listing here. And it's even worse than that. Smart people creating business are leaving. So here we are, 40 years, less than a year, 39 years on, after the Big Bang. My contention, our contention to you, is that now is actually the time for the big reform. We have to stand back and say, how's it going? What can we do better? And in a sense, we've actually got a bit of time. We're in the early stages of an electoral cycle. So we can actually ask some really sort of big picture questions, like with a clean sheet of paper, almost like a sort of brainstorming session in the boardroom. Come up with good ideas, great ideas, mad ideas. That's what brainstorming is all about. But my contention is that we need to look at 4 critical areas in order to try and generate growth, confidence, investment, and belief. Because if we don't, then already the evidence is there in terms of where businesses are listing their companies, where they're raising capital, where they're raising the debt, and where the brightest, smartest entrepreneurs are going. And there are sort of 4 critical areas that I just want to touch on. The first one in terms of regulation. So we just look at the current situation. We've got MiFID II, 30,000 pages, 1.4 million paragraphs. I'm sure they're all seared on all of your hearts. But as I've just shown, that hasn't actually helped. So is it possible to say, well, maybe the precautionary approach to regulation of trying to de-risk everything isn't working? Maybe we need to go to a proactionary approach. Maybe we should say, okay, is it possible? I don't know, but I'll come to the suggestion. Is it possible to turn 30,000 pages of regulation that's failing the city and failing our economy into 100 pages of pro-actionary regulation, but with a very clear difference, that you have a proper sanction, a proper deterrent when things go wrong. How many people in the UK went to jail after the financial crisis? I think the answer is 0. So maybe if you had a proper sanction and a proper deterrent alongside that pro-actionary principle, then I think we have to be prepared to look at it. It's really, really important. We have to ask ourselves challenging questions about the FCA. How's it going? And then we need to look at the PRA and the Bank of England, the MPC. Now, this is the moment where most politicians daren't go there. There is a fear in Westminster that if you mention the Bank of England, you might be perceived as interfering with their independence. No, you're not. All we're suggesting is it's not unreasonable, 27, 28 years after independence was given the Bank of England, to say, how's it going? Have we got the constituency of the MPC right? Have we got the right number of members? Have we got the voting structure right? Have we got the right calibre of people? Is it right that the Bank of England should have a majority? I think we need to seek people's views on all these absolutely critical issues. People will know that I've been challenging the whole issue of whether or not to pay reserves, pay interest on the QE reserves in QT. And Nigel and I had a very genial meeting with the governor just a few weeks ago. But you've got a situation where Parliament has not debated a £200 billion decision, which is a fiscal decision, on the issue of QE and QT. So you have to ask this question. Have we got that right? Is the mandate for the Bank of England right? Not unreasonable, give or take 30 years on to say, well, okay, you've got a mandate to control inflation. What exam mark would we give? Jury's out, I would say. And then, of course, it's got a stability mandate. Well, financial crisis, bond market crisis in 2022. Again, the jury's out. Should it have a growth mandate? Many great economists will say definitely not, some of whom are in this room today. Others will say, well, maybe. We've got a crisis of growth. What we should absolutely do is be so afraid that you daren't talk about it. I think we should talk about it. So, as part of this big reform, we're going to set up working groups to look at these 4 key areas. And regulation is the big one. All of these issues, and we want people to feed into this with your thoughts, and they will be very different. But if we're not even prepared to look at it, to debate it, to question it, then we've got absolutely no chance of changing course. The second key area is what is very dear to our hearts, SME growth capital. SMEs are the bedrock to the UK economy. And Nigel talked about it on Monday. We feel that so passionately. Alarm clock Britain. We're just this morning hearing from a couple of tradespeople. They set their alarm at 4:30 to drive to London to go to work. But actually, for fast-growing businesses, where's the growth capital? 40 years ago, I remember 3i with its regional offices. You could get a 3 or 4 page letter from which you could get 75 to 100 grand capital investment. Now, yes, the world's moved on. 3i's done incredibly, but what's replaced it? And we have to say, what are the ways to ensure that on round 2, 3, 4 of fundraising for your great potential unicorns in the UK, whether it's in fintech, whether it's in life sciences, or whatever, we've got great entrepreneurs and creators, but they're all struggling to raise the appropriate amount of durable finance in order to continue to grow here. And that's a tragedy, because then, of course, their option is to sell out or to go and list somewhere else. So we have to look at the whole structure, including the way we tax growth capital for SMEs. Now, originally, of course, 40 years ago, the AIM market was, in a sense, that's what it was set up to do, and it did pretty well. But the reality is the AIM market now has the fewest number of companies listed on it for 25 years. So that's not going in the right direction. So we have to relook at this. And I know people have sort of thought about it and talked about it, and previous Chancellor Jeremy Hunt, he came up with the Edinburgh reforms, but it was tinkering at the edges. It wasn't really with a clean sheet of paper saying, we need to completely relook at this. But actually, given where we are in the electoral cycle, I think we can. And I think we have to be brave enough to ask these big, big questions. So you've got regulation, you've got SME growth capital, and then we've got the third one, pensions and savings. Vital, but so unbelievably complicated in the UK. Where do you start and where do you begin? Where do you finish? You know, I mean, it's not the most glamorous topic. I did somehow retain the press for 25 minutes when I talked about the local government pension schemes back in September. And I was fairly critical of the cost of managing those LGPS schemes, which is too expensive and they're underperforming. But in reality, we have to, again, ask really serious questions about the way we do pensions in this country. And we'll have to look, we need the best of the best from elsewhere. In Australia, for example, they have a much more glamorous word for pensions. It's called a super. You're much more likely to sit in a pub in Australia and talk about the performance of your super to your 21-year-old neighbour than you are here in the UK talking about the performance of your pension. That's a mindset thing, but it's a simplicity thing. And we need to look again seriously at the whole issue of defined benefit pension schemes in the public sector. And already, I've mentioned it in the last sort of 24 hours, and they're coming at me hard and fast. And that's fine. That's sort of what we do in the world of politics. But the liability for the unfunded pension schemes in the public sector in the UK has grown in the last 20 years from about £750 billion, no one knows what that looks like, to somewhere between 1.5 trillion according to the OBR, but some think it could be as high as 2.5 trillion. What we do know is that it's growing, that liability, off balance sheet, is growing at somewhere between 30 and 50 billion a year. This is not sustainable, and that is the reason, one of the key reasons, why that line, that red line, is heading towards 200% in the next 20 to 25 years. So we have to have a grown-up discussion about unfunded defined benefit pension schemes. And I don't think it's unreasonable to sit down with the unions and to say, look, for new employees, we can do this differently. The private sector did this 20, 25 years ago. But if we're not even prepared to have that discussion, then we're just not going to make the progress that we need to. Because those numbers, that increasing liability, and I touched on it on the LGPS, but it is completely unsustainable. And then you look at ISAs, cash ISAs, stocks ISAs. Again, let's ask the question, if there's 350 billion of cash in ISAs, well, how's that helping the growth of the economy? Question mark. Why should you give tax relief to leave your money sitting in cash? Should we, for example, say, well, yes, of course you can have tax relief if you invest it in UK stocks, because we're short of UK equity capital here. Those are the sort of things that I think we need to have a proper relook at, under a whole relook of pensions and savings. And I know there'll be all sorts of different views, but this is the right time to step back and ask those questions and try and come to a better place. And then fourthly and finally, the sort of the joys of taxation. We are lucky enough in this country to enjoy the largest tax code in the world. A mere 24,000 pages, no one knows within 1,000 pages how long it is. What I can tell you is that it's about 5 times the combined works of Harry Potter, and nothing like as much fun. And that's great for accountants. But when did you last see a child running around a playroom saying, "Daddy, Daddy, I want to be an accountant"? And when you look at countries like Hong Kong, that they have, give or take, 300-page tax codes, and you have other countries that they head towards a sort of a flatter tax system, I don't think it's unreasonable to take a step back and to say, Is it possible, and I don't know, but we must look at it, is it possible to turn a 24,000-page tax code into something, give or take 500 pages, over one parliamentary term or 2 parliamentary terms? Is that possible? If so, what have you got to do? What does it look like? It might not be, but if you don't ask these questions, we know we're overtaxed, we know it's too complicated, we know we've got compliance, 15% of banks. I think we've got to ask these serious questions. And just today, you sort of look at the madness of regulation where we are. We've got the BBC producing an incredible report about the illegality of vape shops and barber shops on our high streets, all in front of our very eyes, literally in plain sight, every high street in the land. And yet all of us driven mad by KYC. I mean, it's the big one. It's even worse than GDPR, pressing the cookie on your phone. And you sort of say, well, what's the point of KYC when you've got all of this money laundering and illegality going on in plain sight? And even to list a house, you have to do KYC. It drives us all nuts. You can check the MOT status of anybody's car if you go to the gov.uk website, updated once a year. Why can't we have our KYC updated once a year with our utility bill on the government website with our national insurance number, that all of the lawyers and estate agents and whoever else is interested can go and check? Completely changes all of that compliance. These are the big questions that I think we've got to ask in order to ease the process of regulation and complication in order to create productive growth. So what I say to you is, this is the moment to have 4 working groups, and we've already got a number of great people to come and work in some of them, and to take 6 months to take all of the great ideas, and some of you in the world of management consultants, hedge funds, brokers, investment banks, my ask of you, set up a small team of some of your brightest folk and set them this challenge. We all love competition. Come up with the best ideas in these different areas. And our working group will also come up with their ideas. And if we feed that in over 6 months, and then if we say we'll take 3 months to look at those ideas, produce a report, then in 9 months' time, just in time for the anniversary, the 40th anniversary of Big Bang, we can say, folks, actually, this is the way that we can change things. This is the way that we can unleash a proper growth strategy for the UK. Yes, the Chancellor's got their challenges, her challenges at the moment, trying to balance the books short term. But we need to step back and look at the medium to long term. We need to recognise that risk on that graph there and say that is not acceptable. But in order to change course, folks, we need your help. We need you to contribute to these working groups. Some people may want to say, I'd love to be on one of these working groups. Yes, please, we just need a bit of your time. They're going to operate under an independent think tank, the Centre for a Better Britain. Sort of like WYSIWYG, it does what it says on the tin. And that's independent of reform, so don't worry, and you can be anonymous or you can be named. That's great. But we need people's help. We need great people, great minds, to come forward and say, 40 years after the Big Bang, now is the time for the big reset. Now is the time for the big rethink. Ladies and gentlemen, now is the time for the big reform. Thank you very much.
So, Richard, thank you for that and setting out the reform agenda going forward. I've got a couple of questions for you before we open it up to the audience. First and foremost, I must say the thought of MiFID II being 100 pages is very welcome to my ears, having spent 2 years on secondment at the Treasury dealing with onshored MiFID post-Brexit. But I think it's a little late for that now for me, but maybe for others. You talked about risk and calculated risk, and regulatory reform has been a big part of the reforms UK's sort of agenda. However, markets remain very alert to fiscal credibility, particularly after the turbulence of the last years. how would you reinsure or reassure investors, many of whom are in this room, that tax cuts, regulatory reform and so forth would be fully costed and sustainable and get that calculated risk balance that you mentioned?
Yeah, and so Nigel gave a big press conference on Monday talking about the economic thinking. Whether you're at home or at work, or whether you're running a council or a country, you cannot keep spending more than you're earning for very long and expect it to end well. At some point, your lenders are going to say, hang on, folks, how are you going to pay us back? And if that graph goes anywhere near that 200% in 20, 25 years, we know at some point there's going to be a problem. And so what we've said is the first thing we've got to do is we've got to cut the vast amount of unproductive, wasteful spending. That's the key. And we're starting to do it in the councils, and Monday the 17th, I'll be going into that in great detail. But the great thing about regulatory reform is that actually, in almost all cases, it doesn't cost anything. It unleashes enormous growth. I mean, I'm a real estate guy. The best thing the Tories did in the early 2010s was to make it basically easy, without planning consent, to convert an office building into residential units. It unleashed the power of growth, and it cost nothing. So I would say that, of course, we want smart, safe regulation. But I think we can achieve that. And because we've got a bit of time to do this, we can step back and say, okay, let's welcome all these ideas and say, okay, what works? And then put it out to consultation and say, well, we like this idea, but actually it may not quite work. The risk might be too high. That's why you've got to ask these questions and get everybody's feedback into it. And I think the thing is, once you're in, anybody who's in government basically doesn't have time to do this. The pressure's too great. Whereas we're in the position where we can ask these questions. We're basically from the world of business. So that's where we're at with it.
Great, thank you. And you touched on the IPO situation. And in fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to the CEO of the Hong Kong regulator, who was talking about the Hong Kong exchange, where on one day they had 7 IPOs.
Wow.
And actually have had 80-something this year, I believe, and 200 in the pipeline. Now, you said that British firms were moving away to the US because of over-regulation. That can't be the only reason they're moving away. I mean, how do you attract listings? And kind of going on from that, I mentioned in my introduction, the UK has been fated as the financial centre of the world, but that is now being threatened in some instances by America, in some instances by China. How do you improve the UK's attractiveness?
Well, I think both from the cost of